Hello and welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Very excited to welcome you to the fourth session in our Culture Change Roadmap webinar series. Today's session will focus on culture transformation, challenges and opportunities in the public sector. I'm Nellie Stansbury, Denison Consulting's Director of Digital Marketing. Today I'm joined by several other members of the Denison team, Bryan Adkins, Gayatri Pandit, and Margaret Gorman. I'll introduce them in a bit more detail in a moment. Before I briefly overview the firm and introduce the team further, turn things over to them, I'd like to encourage you all to utilize the chat and Q&A features below. Please test their functionality by sharing where in the world you're joining us from. Our team will monitor your comments and questions and will post to the speakers at the end of their discussion during Q&A. So I'd like to do a brief overview of the firm. I know many of you are likely familiar with us, but Denison Consulting is a firm focused on large-scale culture transformation and leadership development with over 20 years of experience and 10,000 clients to date in over 50 countries. I'd like to now introduce today's speakers. First, we have Bryan Adkins, partner at Denison Consulting. Bryan's professional background includes leadership positions within the manufacturing, professional, and nonprofit sectors, and he has worked with clients to build high-performing cultures and leaders for over 20 years. Today, Bryan supports many of our key clients and continues our tradition of linking thought leadership and practical insight for maximum impact. We are also joined by Dr. Gayatri Pandit, Denison's Enterprise Solutions and Productization Director. Gayatri brings 20 years of experience as an organizational development consultant, researcher, and practitioner. She is an accomplished human capital strategist with experience leading projects in the federal government and private and nonprofit sectors. Gayatri leads Denison's productization process as part of our growth strategy. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Bryan and Gayatri to get things started. Again, feel free to submit questions and comments in the chat and Q&A.
Great. Thanks, Nellie. And on behalf of Gayatri and myself, also want to extend our welcome and appreciation for people taking time out of their schedules to join us today. As we focus the discussion on our work in the public sector, at Denison, over the last 25 years, we've done a fair amount of work in the public sector. Any given year, probably about 25% of the work that we do is public sector organization related. And so you'll see on the agenda here, the first point about just sharing a little bit about that experience. And really just at a high level, the key point here is that we have worked with public sector organizations, and the public sector often defined as that part of the economy that's controlled by government. We've worked with these types of organizations pretty much in every part of the globe: Australia, Asia, Europe, Middle East, North America, South America. And we've certainly learned a lot about what it's like to work in those environments. And the public sector is a pretty large sector, as you might imagine. And so within the public sector, we've worked in state-owned telecommunication organizations. We've worked in law enforcement. We've worked with public health agencies, different public utilities, public transit, agriculture organizations, defense-related, intelligence-related. So just a wide range of organizations also within the public sector, but also across the globe. So that really helps set the stage for what we wanted to be able to do today, which is to first talk about some of what we'll call the traditional positive attributes and some of the challenges that come with working in the public sector, and to share a little bit about our data and what we see as some trends in the public sector and what are some of the implications around that. And then ways that we've worked with these types of organizations to really try to build on some of the positive attributes that they bring, as well as address some of the challenge areas that they might face. And then we'll summarize that at a very high level towards the end and talk about some ways that we think culture transformation in the public sector can be moved forward. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Gayatri so that she can begin talking about what are some of those traditional views that people have about the public sector. So over to you, Gayatri.
Thank you, Bryan, and welcome everyone. So we know that there are multiple traditionally understood positive attributes of working in the public sector. The most commonly understood attraction tends to be the purpose or mission of these organizations. But the sense of stability, the sense of job security offered by such organizations, the benefits offered by these organizations, especially the longer term benefits, are all attractors to public sector organizations. There's an assumption of greater work-life balance, especially as compared to the private sector. And there are potentially greater and more, perhaps even more straightforward opportunities for movement between organizations. There appear to be greater learning opportunities that are supported in the form of formal, informal forums, communities, or networks across organizations. An example that comes to mind, especially in the US, is the Senior Executive Service, which offers formal and informal networking opportunities across federal agencies, or the Chief Human Capital Officer Council, which is an intra-agency forum for Chief Human Capital Officers to network and advise each other and coordinate efforts. I'm sure there are more positive attributes, but these were the ones we felt were the most commonly referenced traditional positive attributes. On the next slide, you'll see similarly, there are traditionally some challenges associated with the public sector. We know that change efforts are driven by budget constraints and strong scrutiny of how funding and budgets are being dispersed. Unlike the private sector, where change is initiated to immediately see an impact on success measures, we see change efforts in the public sector often being redirected or sometimes even lagging when new leaders come into the picture. We see public officials and leaders necessarily moving, perhaps by political appointment, perhaps by requirements of their occupation, and this results in a shift in priorities of the leadership. We know that change is often, and although that's changing to some extent now, but change is often driven by policy, and the purpose of change seems to be focused more on compliance. Case in point is what we're seeing now with the diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility focus across the US federal agencies. There's a perception that public sector organizations are typically slower to change or innovate. The cycle of change is longer, especially when it comes to transformational change or decentralizing innovation to the lowest levels of the workforce. These perceived traditional positive attributes and challenges can be both attractors or detractors when we think of the public sector as an employer. But before we move ahead, let's pause and take a poll on what you all think, based on your experience, are the traditionally understood positive attributes and challenges of the public sector. I'll hand over to Nellie to help us with the poll.
Yes, thanks, Gayatri. I'm going to launch this poll. And as Gayatri said, we're just asking you to select, in your opinion, the top 2 positive attributes or attractors of public sector employment and the top 2 challenges of public sector employment. And I have launched that. And if you have an additional option that's not listed there, we'd love to hear. So submit in the chat and Q&A.
That's great. And while people are taking the time to do that, I think it's worth noting that while these are some of the traditional views, we certainly don't think they're necessarily universal within the public sector. We've seen great examples of public sector organizations in different parts of the globe that are quite dynamic, quite agile, quite innovative in the approaches that they take to the work that they do. We've seen them face some real challenges when it comes to things like work-life balance in the workplace. And so Again, these are some of the more traditionally held views, but not necessarily representative of every public sector organization by any means. So it sounds like we still have some votes coming in.
Yeah, it looks like people are slowing down though. So maybe we'll give folks another 10 seconds and then we'll end the poll, show the results and move on.
Excellent. And as Nellie said, if there are some key either attractors or detractors that you've experienced or are aware of that aren't captured here, please do send them in the chat, and we can perhaps talk about those later on in our discussion.
All right, I'm going to end the poll and share the results out. Bryan,
Job security, job security and stability coming out number 1 and 2, with benefits close behind, and then purpose and mission. Excellent. And then how about from the more challenging areas?
Change resistant and slow to innovate seems to be the highest, and shifting priorities of leaders, public officials, and budget competition and constraints are about the same, as is overemphasis on policies, regulations, and compliance. Yep.
Change resistance, budget. Excellent. Okay, great. Well, appreciate folks sharing those perspectives, and not dissimilar to some of our own experiences and what we've seen happen with our clients in the public sector. So I think what we'll do here is, and we're going to come back and we'll talk about some of these challenge areas, and we'll share some of the practices and ways that we've tried to help organizations address those. But I think it's also, it sets up an opportunity for us to take a step back for a moment and think about our model, our culture model. And as Nellie said at the outset, I know there's probably quite a few of you joining us today who are familiar with the Denison model. There may be some of you for whom our model is new. So I'll say just a few quick points about this. One of the things that is at the core of our model is this notion of dynamic tensions. So the right side of our model, where we're looking at mission and purpose and strategies and goals, along with consistency, where we're looking at the core values and our ability to coordinate across different parts of the organization and to solve problems, come to agreement. We often refer to that as kind of the stable side of our culture model. Left-hand side, you've got the adaptability that really looks at our ability to change and adapt to the environment around us, understand and respond to our customer wants and needs, and to create a learning organization where it's safe to try things, make mistakes, we'll learn from those rather than get into any kind of like finger pointing type activities, as well as the involvement trait here, which is really about involving our employees by empowering them, having them collaborate in teams, and making sure we're investing and developing in their skills and capabilities. And that left side of the model reflects more of the flexible side of things. It also has a top-bottom sort of break there, in terms of the top being a bit more externally focused, the bottom being a bit more internally focused. And when organizations are performing at their best, they tend to be doing all of these things reasonably well. People are pretty clear, pretty aligned around what they're trying to do, why they're trying to do it, how they're expected to do it. And this notion of being clear and aligned around what we're doing is not about a state of perfection. There's too much going on internally and externally for organizations to have sort of perfect clarity, perfect alignment. We know that internally there are leadership changes, there are reorganizations, there's new technologies that we introduce. We know externally that the political environment, the economic climate, and other disruptors can create some uncertainty and ambiguity. But our research shows time and time again that regardless of the sector that you're in, the ability to create more clarity and more alignment across all of these dimensions helps organizations perform at a higher level, helps organizations be seen as attractive for talent and the ability to retain talent, for organizations who are looking to be viewed as an employer of choice, which many organizations today are, again, regardless of sector. Being able to manage these dynamic tensions becomes quite important. So when we think about that in the context of what you all just shared with us in terms of thinking, well, the stability side is something that is a benefit of potentially working in the public sector. The change resistance side is perhaps a detractor, and that's absolutely right. I mean, we need organizations that have some level of stability, but also have the ability to adapt. And so I'd like to share a little bit more about some of the things that we've learned as we've worked in the public sector. And one of the first things I'll show you here is a composite, what you see on the right-hand side here. It's a composite of about 15 very large public sector organizations from across the globe. And a lot of times when we make a composite of a set of organizations, maybe that's by geography, if we want to look at differences in regions or countries, or we make composites of organizations that are all financial services or technology or manufacturing. One of the interesting things that we see when we do that is that they all tend to, on average, look about average. When you bring a bunch of organizations together, their data together, they tend to hover around the 50th percentile, because in that set of organizations, you'll have some higher performing, some lower performing, and some average performing organizations. What we see here when we do this with the public sector is a little bit different. The scores tend to be a bit lower than what we might see in other sectors, industries, and geographies, and quite lower in some areas. And so what we see in this pattern probably reinforces to some extent some of those traditionally held perceptions, being more stable than flexible as we look at the right side versus the left side of the data. Perhaps being a bit more internally focused than externally focused. So you see more color, higher scores down in the bottom half of the model. You also see some really significant gaps there around creating change and organizational learning. We'll say a little bit more about that as we go, but again, certainly aligns with some of your perceptions about change being one of the more challenging areas sometimes in the public sector. We also see something that wasn't necessarily expecting, but lower collaboration scores. If you look at the team orientation down in the green section and the coordination over in the yellow consistency area, these are both measures of collaboration within teams and across teams. And lower scores there does perhaps give you some indication that there may be a bit more reliance on some of that hierarchical top-down decision-making, leadership styles, and that the challenges with working across teams might contribute to and reinforce some of the silos, stovepipe behavior that we often hear about in some of these public sector organizations as well. And stepping back and thinking about all of this in the context of today's hybrid work environment, we think there are some real implications and some real challenges for public sector organizations when we know that we're in an environment that does require greater flexibility, that's requiring building stronger and more trusting relationships between leaders and employees. And so want to take just a few more minutes, and I'm going to share some additional insights from our work that that we've experienced and that we've also had the opportunity to try to help public sector organizations manage and think through. And I'll start with one of the things that we often find when we first get introduced into some of these organizations, and that's what I'm going to call an absence of an understanding of culture as a system. And in this day and age, we still hear organizations talk a lot about the importance of employee morale, employee engagement. We believe that those are important as well. But when we think about culture, culture is really about the collective. It's about the system, how the system operates, not just how I personally feel about my work environment. And so even though there are a lot of organizations out there, and this isn't unique to the public sector, but it's certainly, I think, more prevalent in the public sector, that what we find is that the way they get feedback from their workforce is usually through these more traditional morale engagement type assessments, not assessments that are really stepping back and looking at culture as a system. Something else that we notice over there on the left side at the bottom, it talks about these assessments that they do use are often not benchmarked in any way. So you get a score in a particular area, you don't know if that's a good score, a lower score, an average score. Or when there is benchmarking that happens, it's often against other public sector organizations, which we think can create a little bit of a tunnel vision, especially in this environment where public sector organizations are often competing for the same talent that is working in other sectors. And so a real opportunity from our perspective to sort of widen the lens in terms of what you measure and how you measure that. On the right-hand side, a couple of things that we often are confronted with or experience when we get invited into public sector organizations is just what I'd call an underlying frustration that, as all of you pointed out earlier, change efforts can be really difficult. There's a lot of ingrained behaviors there that at leadership levels and employee levels that can make change efforts more difficult, often because of an over-reliance on hierarchy. So that notion that very top down in terms of how decisions are made, people don't necessarily feel comfortable going across the organization. They kind of stay in their lanes. This fear we often hear of challenging how things get done. So you might think about this in the context of psychological safety. So people are sometimes fearful of making mistakes, of failures, of getting on the wrong side of a leader or a set of leaders and seeing that as potentially harmful to them in their careers. And so what happens? Well, at the bottom there on the right, you'll see lots of discussions that we find ourselves in around trust and trust issues in the organization. Lots of references to silos and silo behavior and people unwilling to sort of step out of their own area of functional expertise. And what has become more common these days to have people talk about this notion of quiet quitting, which isn't really actual quitting of the job, but rather just people who are no longer kind of giving that extra effort, doing kind of the minimal that it takes to get by. And so those are some of the things that we often are confronted with when we go into organizations. And just to give you a quick example of when I was talking about assessments that focus on things like morale and engagement versus culture, we did, for one of our public sector organizations, we did a mapping exercise where we looked at some of the things they were measuring currently against our model and what might be captured if we were using our model to do some assessment. And what we found is, the areas that are grayed out here, some important areas like change and customer focus and strategies and coordination. A lot of the topics that we find are really prevalent in concern areas or issue areas in public sector organizations weren't even being measured for. And even some of the areas where we did see some overlap, whether that be in organizational learning or empowerment, et cetera, there was minimal data there to really give us a good sense of how well people felt like as an organization, people were empowered or people were clear about their vision or the core values that they were supposed to abide by. So we noticed those gaps. And when we think about organizations, again, regardless of the sector here, but certainly we think this is important for public sector organizations, given some of the challenges we see when we go in there. What is it that can help them be more intentional about culture, understanding culture, measuring culture, managing culture? Well, probably not a surprise that one of the first things that we think is important is adopting a culture model. And we're a bit biased in terms of those models, but we certainly think our model is a good one to adopt. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, it does fit the bill in terms of being a systems approach. It gives you a very clear but systemic view of the strengths and challenges within the organization. And as important, if not more importantly, the notion that it's performance-based. Culture is a pretty big topic. It's complex. It's got a lot of moving pieces to it. What we've always tried to do with our model and our work is really focus on those aspects of culture that are consequential, that impact how an organization gets their work done day in and day out. So having a model, a systems model, a performance-based model, but also then being able to apply this and create a process in the organization. So a lot of the organizations, public and private sector for that matter, that we work with, who have developed a really strong intentional process around or approach to how they address culture. Yes, they use cultural assessments and they do those at regular intervals, so people know that it's going to come around again and again and again. Each time they go through one of these cycles of data collection, they're sharing the results, often at the senior leadership levels first, to see at a high level where people are more clear, more aligned, or more ambiguity exists in the organization. Those findings are shared out through the organization, distributed out to groups so that organizations and groups within the organization can identify some gap areas, some priorities for action, implement those actions. And it just becomes a routine. It becomes institutionalized, so to speak, in the organization, where they're managing their culture with intention. And so we think that that's an important aspect for a lot of the public sector organizations who, again, might be a little bit more narrowly focused today from an engagement perspective, to be able to broaden their lens and think more systemically and put culture sort of front and center in the work that they do. And a couple more things I'll share with you before I turn it back over to my colleague Gayatri is, here's an example of just one public sector organization that we've worked with through the years. And what you're seeing here is essentially a time one and a time two snapshot of the culture. Time one being very early on in their adopting and implementing a culture development process. And one thing that you'll notice here is that early on, their culture profile was not necessarily all that dissimilar from what we saw in that composite, a bit stronger here, but you'll see some stronger scores on the right side, the stable side. You'll see some stronger scores on the bottom half, the internal focus, and you'll see some lower scores, particularly in that organizational learning, creating change aspect. And by taking an intentional approach, by measuring, setting priorities, creating actions, implementing those over time, and creating that cycle. So what you see in time two is roughly about 2 or 3 survey cycles after that first one. And it shows what we would hope and expect to see, which is some quite significant progress for an organization, in this case, that had tens of thousands of employees. Pretty significant progress in terms of how clear they were about their priorities, how they were expected to show up. Their core values showed tremendous progress, but also good progress in some of those other key areas around change and organizational learning. And there was one other data point that we captured here. Let me just go back for a second. You'll see at the very bottom that as the culture was progressing, we also saw a pretty significant jump in people's trust and confidence in the managers who were their leaders. And I'll share one more data point with you. And this is looking at leadership data. And this is leadership data that's only about a year, maybe 18 months apart from another public sector organization where they also use our Leadership 360. So when you think about being intentional about culture development, being able to look at the organization, important. Being able to look at subgroups across the organization, also very important. One of the benefits of our model is we can also look at leaders individually and provide leaders with personal feedback in terms of how their people, their superiors, their bosses, their colleagues, peers, and their direct reports see them showing up in these critical areas to culture. And so that really puts culture, if you will, front and center, not just from an organizational or team perspective, but also from an individual perspective. And so you've got sort of a multi-pronged approach at how you're trying to develop the culture of the organization. So with that, I'm going to shift gears a bit. I'm going to hand it off to Gayatri, and she's going to talk a little bit more about some of the kinds of specific approaches that we've used with organizations to help move the needle, similar to what we saw in the samples I just showed.
Thank you, Bryan. As Bryan has mentioned a few times, we view culture from a systems perspective to diagnose challenges and pursue transformation. As we have worked with public sector organizations across the globe, we have found certain approaches work well on the specific challenges that are indicated for each index of our model, which is not to say this is the only list of challenges or approaches that should be undertaken. What we are really sharing is what we have seen work well in a specific context for specific challenges. Applying the transformation process that Bryan shared earlier, we have often seen that organizations, thinking about the intentional approach, organizations perform these assessments, organizations, even our assessment, and if there is the same level of energy using those results, thinking through actions, and then implementing those actions, very often the implementation is handed over to other teams. And that's sometimes where they lose steam or that lack of sponsorship lets the implementation take a different direction. So a lot of our recommended approaches help with continuing that momentum. Using the public sector composite that we shared of the 15 large public sector organizations and thinking only about the mission index right here, we know that purpose and mission and the strategic direction are attractors. All of you did say that, and you also talked about job security. But when we talk about the importance of the public sector organizations paying attention to culture, we very often, anecdotally, in terms of qualitative feedback and quantitative feedback here, people talk about wanting to work for organizations that have that sense of, that offer them that sense of mission, that sense of service, and that sense of supporting their community. And public sector organizations have a tremendous opportunity in leveraging this sense of mission. The key, though, is how to help the employees see that connection of the organization to the mission and to their own jobs and their own activities. We have seen challenges with alignment between the human capital strategy with the broader strategic direction of the organization. We've seen challenges which actually exist in private sector organizations as well, in the leader alignment between senior leaders and their tasks and how they want to be seen as an aligned leadership team. So we identify and initiate facilitation and support approaches based on some of these specific challenges and the unique context of each organization. Most of these approaches can be used in different contexts, but we've seen that organizations often tend to have a strategy. They tend to have those strategic objectives and goals and the mission. And we also see a lack of clarity at the individual or team level about how the individuals play a role in the accomplishment of the strategy or the goals or the mission. What we have offered and supported this model, we call it the CCCR model. It's the create, communicate, clarify, and reinforce model. The focus is we can help organizations create and communicate the strategic direction, the mission of the organization, and we have offered that support. But we've also seen very often, once this strategic document is out there, leaders don't talk about it. Leaders don't link it back to the ongoing initiatives, to the mission critical tasks. So the communication and the clarification, the reinforcement support we offer helps leaders embed those messages in their ongoing tasks. If there are other activities that are focused on the culture, on changing the culture of the organization, we help the leaders link those to the strategic direction of the organization. And then part of this is the leadership team alignment. Part of this is the strategic level alignment. We'll not go into the detail of the approaches, but the point is that being intentional about the organization's culture means thinking through what your leadership scores, what your culture scores truly mean for the current culture, the challenges of the culture, how you identify the culture, and what that means for the future as well in terms of daily activities. For the next, for the adaptability index, it's interesting that customer focus was in the composite that we created strong. I think it emphasizes the point that we said before, that people very often join public sector organizations for the purpose, for the mission, to see their efforts being reflected in that support to the customer, whoever that customer might be for these public sector organizations. What you'll see in our selection of approaches is that we tend to focus on the customer as a strength of the organization. Employees join the organization for the purpose and for support of the customer, but very often the jobs of the employees are fairly far removed from that customer connection. We help the organizations think through who the customers are, internal and external, what that customer connection means, and how to strengthen it. Another example is the habits change exercise, which is useful when very often we're seeing the public sector workforce being split between the largely tenured employees and the newer employees who come in and leave to go join private sector. The habits exercises help for such a split workforce, especially around challenges that Bryan mentioned earlier around psychological safety or resilience of the organization. For example, we've seen, especially in terms of psychological safety, we've seen a disconnect between behaviors and habits. We know in the context of, inclusivity, having a more inclusive workspace generates a safer workspace, but that requires a deeper level habits change. We work with teams to identify the good and the bad, the old and the new habits, and think through which habits should be strengthened and perfected, which old habits should be strengthened and perfected, and these are probably being demonstrated by the tenured workforce, and which should be unlearned and rethought of and changed to accomplish the type of environment, the safety, the inclusive environment that the organization is looking for. As on the next slide, you'll see this is an example of this is a representation of the composites scores as far as involvement. An example here is the diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility focus of multiple public sector organizations. There's widespread emphasis on the DEI and A aspects. But what we've primarily seen is an emphasis mainly on increasing diversity. And that's an admirable goal, and that's being accomplished. But what we're seeing is that the inclusivity aspect of the DEIA is often not understood or implemented because, again, that's a habit change. We know that leaders modeling these behaviors is a critical aspect of that change. So using the example that Bryan shared earlier about working with leaders, working with them through 360 surveys, and working with them through one-on-one coaching, we help them reflect on their inclusive behaviors to understand the impact of these behaviors on success measures, and also help them craft ongoing change actions to change their behaviors, but also see the impact of those changes on their subordinates, the lower level leaders at the individual level. I'm going to move quickly to the next slide, and then we'll pause for questions. So the consistency index, we've seen multiple references to transformations going on in public sector organizations, primarily digital transformations that necessarily require some change in the design of the organization, just multiple changes in role relationships. Simultaneously, there are reorganizations that are a result of the changed political environment. All of these impact cohesion of the culture. Very often, the strong sense of mission and purpose also tend to result in silos and collaboration challenges, especially as the leadership changes. Regardless of the traditional assumption of greater work-life balance in the public sector, we've seen more feedback on increased workload and challenges with work-life balance, especially for high visibility organizations. And that tends to impact the stress level of employees and also dampen innovation at the individual level. I've talked about the CCCR model in the past, and we've used that successfully in helping organizations identify and think through silos. Another example is the give-get sessions. These are sessions where we typically involve multiple action teams and multiple other stakeholders. And these sessions are focused on identifying and working with specific success factors. And these success factors could be anything like identifying which senior leaders should be participating in specific action initiatives, or what might be the appropriate hybrid work success measures. And then we work with the different stakeholders to identify what each stakeholder role gets and gives to their counterpart for each action. So for example, if it's the engagement of the senior leadership provides insights into decisions and priorities for actions, and whoever is in the action team gets a partner in the form of senior leaders for problem solving and resolution of barriers. So I've walked through multiple approaches really quickly, but we can pause and we can explain these and we can share information about these. But right now I'm going to hand over to Bryan to talk about the path forward.
Sure. Thanks, Gayatri. And I think as you were talking about those, it's really important. It links back to this notion of culture as a system, because so many of the types of interventions and activities that we engage clients with, maybe start out as a coordination and integration issue or an empowerment issue, but very quickly, we learn that, coordination and integration is around what are we trying to coordinate and integrate around? And so maybe that links us back to a specific strategy or a set of goals. Or maybe we find out that part of the challenges with coordination is that one group doesn't have the skill sets that they need to deliver. And so it takes us to the capability development area. But that's where the systemic look at things, I think, becomes really important. And so as we wrap up here, just kind of a reminder of a few things that we've talked about, that, you know, the public sector really does have some traditionally recognized positive attributes and challenges. We think a lot of those positive attributes need to get further amplification. The mission piece is one that Gayatri referenced earlier. It's been pretty striking to me through the years that sometimes the public sector organizations, NGOs, not-for-profit organizations that we work with, who have some of the most clear and compelling missions you'll find anywhere, do have lower scores in that red section. And when you talk to the employees, they say, yes, you know, this is why I joined the organization. But our leaders don't really talk about it that much. They just kind of assume that that's why we're here, and they never reference the mission, the purpose. They don't talk about how our work is impacting that. So a real opportunity for further amplification in that particular area. And a lot of the challenge areas that we've already talked about around change and flexibility and building those trusting relationships, creating that psychologically safe environment. Those limitations, if not addressed, are going to really continue to stress those organizations, as we see employees today having so many choices about not only who to work for, but where to work. And so we think there's just a real need to pay attention to those. And that the way to move forward is, one, adopting that kind of cultural approach, a culture systems model and a way of assessing culture, the ability to benchmark on a global basis, because you're competing now globally for talent, building the cultural competence of the organization by creating a process where culture is something that we have a framework for, we have a common language around, we have a way to measure it, we have a way to manage it, and we can do that at the organizational, team, and individual levels. And by just, you know, being intentional about the process, so that people understand that culture is something that's foremost in the minds of the leaders of the organization. So I'll stop there, and we'll invite Nellie back into our discussion here and see if we've gotten some questions that Gayatri and I can help speak to.
Thanks, Bryan. Yeah, we've got a good number of questions here. Some of them, let me pull up some of them. I know you spoke to some of this, Gayatri, in talking about the different approaches, but one of our participants wrote, are the activities/initiatives that public sector organizations undertake to improve areas different from what private sector organizations take? And does Denison maintain a database/library of activities that correlate with positive, negative impact on scores within specific areas?
Yeah. The first question, are the activities different? No, they're not different from private sector. The approach we take might be different because, yes, that hierarchy does exist. There are multiple leaders that you would work with in the public sector. And we are in the process of creating a database. It's more of an interactive interface of our resources for transformation and for using the culture assessment, not necessarily correlated with positive and negative impact on scores, because as Bryan mentioned, the positive and negative impact might not be the ideal way to look at that, might not be in isolation. It's really thinking about the tensions and thinking about the relationships between the indexes. So yes, library, but not necessarily related or linked directly to the scores, because that limits the flexibility. But I'll let Bryan speak to that because he's done the work with the tensions.
Yeah, no, I think you've summed it up quite well, that generally speaking, I mean, ultimately, we always say it's part of our job and part of our responsibility is to meet organizations where they are. And so regardless of the sector, whether it's public sector, private sector, we're trying to meet organizations where they are. And we're just simply trying to understand what are some of the key cultural challenges they face, as well as some of the strengths that they can leverage, and then help them move on from there. And some of the practices around that are not necessarily sector specific. They're more about organizational performance specific. And yes, we've captured a lot of different best practices through the years, and we have those in a variety of different formats. Some linked back to specific indexes and traits of the Denison model that we can absolutely share. And I know, as Gayatri said, we're working on putting that into some new forms that are a bit more interactive as well.
Thanks, you two. Another question, less specific about the public sector, but more about culture change in general. How do you encourage organizations to recognize that culture change is not an overnight change?
That's a great question. And one thing I will say at this point in time is that I think people's understanding around culture has evolved quite a bit over the last 20 years. Early on, we were much more likely to find ourselves in situations where people were saying, okay, our culture needs improvement. Like, what's the one thing we can do to improve the culture? And we'd like to have that, by next year, if possible. And, some version of kind of like the silver bullet response they were looking for. Don't run into that quite as much these days. I think people are starting to understand that culture is the way we do things day in, day out in our organization. I think they understand that, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of external influences that affect our ability to get our jobs done. There's a lot of internal things that we do that can disrupt the way things get done, often, and more often than not, very well intended, but often some unintended consequences that come with that. And so they recognize that now this is about culture is something that's just ongoing. It's something we always have to pay attention to, which is why we think that intentional approach, that process I talked about earlier, becomes so important, because otherwise the culture just kind of moves and goes in its sort of own direction. And there can be a lot of ambiguity, a lot of uncertainty in an organization about how things get done, what we're supposed to prioritize and focus on, without that intentionality. So less time these days trying to convince people that this is a journey, but also, still a lot of opportunity to help people see how they can map their way through that journey.
I have another question which speaks to one of our participants' experiences. So a little bit of background here. The participant wrote, I'm working with an organization which has its purpose set forth within the US Constitution. In such a situation, would it be acceptable to see very low scores across all 12 factors, especially within vision and strategic intent, or would that still be considered a strong opportunity for comprehensive organizational development? And then they went on to say, essentially, the internal view in this organization is that they have very little flexibility to do their work differently or improve upon it. Wondered if you had some thoughts there.
I'll start, and Gayatri, feel free to jump in on this one. I think it's pretty rare that people in an organization, set the purpose. I think, usually that's a founder of an organization. In this case, it may be the founders of a country who identified, a purpose for a particular organization or endeavor. And so I think it's important that that purpose be something that's used to try to attract people who find that compelling and who want to be a part of that. But even beyond just having a purpose in terms of why we're here, why we're doing the work that we do, I've just never seen an example of an organization who was able to fulfill and do its purpose, fulfill its purpose effectively without needing to change, adapt, and engage the people that work in that environment. And so it's just really hard for me to see an environment or think about an environment where having people working together in teams is not important, where people behaving and aligning to a certain set of core values is not important, where meeting the needs of your shareholder or stakeholders, I should say, is not important. So it would be a great one to learn more about, and perhaps there's some ways we could potentially help. But anything you would add to that one, Gayatri?
No, I think you said it all. I think the other part is, if people think, I think you mentioned, the participant mentioned people thinking they have very little flexibility to improve their work. As Bryan was talking about, there are the other indexes, and how even if they feel they have low flexibility, the intent of working or getting the culture scores is to link back to the performance. So, and also the other part is the culture scores are based on a global benchmark. So the short answer is yes, there is this, having low scores is an opportunity for organizational development. Having low scores, that's why we showed you the time 1 and time 2, because there's always an intent within the organization to be better, to perform better, even if the purpose is set externally. So yes, if the scores are low and there is intent and there is an expressed awareness in the organization to perform better or to change towards another desired state, that is an opportunity for development.
Thank you both. I think we have time for one more and then we'll wrap up. One of our participants wrote, do you see any notable differences between the public and private sector in how culture drivers are playing out along generational lines?
I think the answer is yes, to some degree. I think we're starting to see, there's lots of reports, and particularly if you look at this in the United States, I know just tenure in organizations and look at age ranges in organizations, and the public sector tends to have a bit more mature, longer tenured workforce than you see in some other areas. It is pretty fascinating that clients we've worked with in the Middle East, clients we've worked with in South America, clients we've worked with in Europe, who are all public sector organizations, the generational piece seems to come into those conversations a lot. They're concerned about how do they attract younger people into the organizations. They're concerned about how they retain that talent. And so I would say, while that's a concern for organizations in general, it's certainly a stronger concern, and I think a legitimately so stronger concern for a lot of public sector organizations. At least that's what we've been seeing so far. Anything you would add to that one, Gayatri, based on your experience?
No, I would say that's true, and also that's truer for specific occupations, especially the traditional, as we mentioned, the traditional assumptions do not apply for certain areas for cybersecurity or AI. So some of these strong generational differences, we do see them more in certain occupations where there's a stronger competition of talent from the private sector.
All right. Thank you both for your time, and thank everyone who's joined. I think we don't have any additional time for more questions, but we will look through your chat and questions Q&A if we didn't get a chance to answer them live and get back to you. Before we hop off, I just wanted to say that the last session in the Culture Change Roadmap webinar series will feature a client story and will be on November 30th. We'll send out some information in the follow-up, and yes, we will share the presentation and the recording with all of you. But thank you again, Bryan, Gayatri, for your time, And thank you to everyone who took the time to join us today. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Yep. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Nellie. Thank you, everyone.